first got interested in forensic pathology, I thought that an exciting thing that I would do would be figuring out people that had been killed and no one had realized that it was a murder. And I've done that a few times. But what I didn't realize that equally important, and pretty much an equal number of times, I'd be presented a case which I was told was in fact murder, but I would find that it wasn't murder at all. I remember a particularly vivid example that came through our office. I work in the southeast of the United States, where it's hot and humid during the summer, and this particular death occurred in late July. The woman was an alcoholic. She lived in a little shack, just a tumble-down shack with her father. They had no utilities, no air conditioning, no light, nothing. The father thought that something might be wrong with his daughter, so he went to the nearest neighbor's house who had a telephone to call for help. Paramedics got there. The house was dark. It was like an oven inside. It was so hot. They couldn't see, so they grabbed her up, put her on a gurney, transported her into the ambulance, and started on their way to a local hospital. Tried to resuscitate her. They could not resuscitate her. Then, when they stopped trying to resuscitate her, the various physicians started looking at her, and they saw that she had these purple marks all over her body and these raw, ugly wounds on her wrists and ankles. And so they got to wondering what could explain findings such as that. And the best that they could figure out was that this woman was being held captive, that this man, perhaps he was her father, perhaps not, but whatever, he was keeping her bound as some sort of slave for whatever evil purposes he had in mind or enjoyed. And so they contacted the police to report a homicide. And the police said, well, let's let the medical examiner look at the body and let's see what the medical examiner has to say about it, and then we'll act. The physicians involved thought that was a little too slow. They were interested in getting up a gang right then and going and catching this guy and punishing him as they thought he deserved. But the body came to our office and we examined it. And what we found was a woman. She was middle-aged, but she looked older than that. And she was an alcoholic. She had cirrhosis, it turned out. But the really important thing was all this purple discoloration and these raw marks that the hospital physicians were seeing were early decomposition. Those sorts of changes usually don't develop for about 24 hours after a person dies at room temperature. But of course, this woman was in a place that was hotter. Not only that, but the real reason that she died was because she had pneumonia. And often pneumonia goes hand in hand with sepsis, that is, bacteria seeding through the blood. And so, in that circumstance, you've actually circumvented the first 24 hours of decomposition. She had gone from dying to decomposing in a matter of minutes rather than in a matter of 24 hours. So all these changes that the physicians were misinterpreting as injuries were actually postmortem changes caused by decomposition. So the question might arise, why did she have these injuries on her wrists and ankles? And the answer is because that's where the paramedics picked her up to put her on the gurney. The medical personnel themselves had caused those injuries, but they didn't realize it because physicians in this country just aren't familiar with seeing what a decomposing body looks like. That is, all physicians except for forensic pathologists. But happily, we were able to recognize this for what it was and classify the death as a natural death. Sometimes attorneys think that we don't, that is, we forensic scientists don't help people who have been accused of crimes because we're called to testify in people who have been accused of crimes. But what they don't understand is, in this circumstance, I had already decided there was no crime, so no charges were ever filed against the father of this woman. He was never falsely accused of something that never even happened in the first place. That is an exciting application of forensic pathology.
I work at the Los Angeles County Department of Coroner, where we perform a lot of the medical legal death investigation. In fact, The entire department focuses on all of Los Angeles County, which is comprised of about 4,500 square miles, and we typically handle upwards of 8,000 bodies or decedents each and every year. I unfortunately have the task of performing a lot of the toxicology work in LA County, and we happen to be a hotspot for some of the high-profile type deaths. In my tenure, I've worked on River Phoenix, I've dealt with Corey Haim, Bubba Smith, Michael Jackson was a prominent figure in my career, recently Whitney Houston, and all of those type of deaths are heavily scrutinized by the media, by the public. Everyone wants to know the answers immediately. Every autopsy that's performed, typically on those high-profile type of deaths, are always going to be inconclusive. They will never bring out the final findings until all the different studies have been performed. And that's one of them is toxicology. So the biggest concern, at least when Michael Jackson died, and it was such high-profile type death, is that why does toxicology take so long? And typically, it can take 6 to 8 weeks. However, you can push it through quickly. I had the pleasure of also testifying in the Michael Jackson trial as well. It was a couple of days on the stand. Again, the Los Angeles District Attorney was, prosecuting Conrad Murray for homicide, and just to deal with the media scrutiny that was going on, along with the cameras in the courtroom. It happened to be one of my second trials where I actually had cameras in the courtroom, and yes, you do forget about those cameras in there, but you do have a back memory that they are in that courtroom as well. So I sometimes think a lot of people play to the camera, the district attorney, the defense attorneys, you got the judge giving ammunitions that are far beyond what I'm typically dealing with. The toxicology is one aspect, it's the drug analysis, and specifically in that case, propofol was the hot topic that you had to deal with and interpret. Unfortunately, I was only the person who did the analysis for the drugs. I wasn't actually asked what they actually meant because they brought in anesthesiologists for that. When I began my career in LA 23 years ago, it was not as a toxicologist, it was more as a criminalist. I actually kind of do two functions. I am a criminalist as well as a toxicologist as my main discipline. But at the coroner's office, we also deal with toxicology, but we also deal with crime scene investigation. And so it adds a different element, a different hat to the repertoire that I deal with. I used to go out to crime scenes, collect physical evidence, and then come back and deal with the evidence as well as the toxicology. So you get a complete variety, at least in the job in Los Angeles County.
I'm a forensic toxicologist. I have a background and training in analytical chemistry and pharmacology and toxicology. So what forensic toxicologists do is study the adverse effects of drugs and poisons and how that applies in the investigation of criminal cases. So, for example, forensic toxicologists are part of a team that contribute towards death investigation. So we'll take information from the scene of a suspicious death. We'll take information from the autopsy, and we'll apply that information to decide what kind of testing to perform on tissues and fluids that are collected at autopsy to disclose the presence of drugs or poisons that might have caused or contributed to a person's death. So that could be anything from drug overdose to an occupational exposure to toxic chemicals. And then once the results in the lab are generated, we typically measure how much of the drug is present. We look at things like how might drugs interact with one another to cause a toxic reaction, how might drugs and alcohol together have combined to have caused a person's death. And we provide that information back to the medical examiner, and then they take all of that information, the patient's history, the scene, indicators from the scene, findings they made at autopsy from histology, and the toxicology, and they'll determine the most appropriate cause and manner of death. Two other areas where forensic toxicologists work are in what's called human performance toxicology, which would be the investigation of how a person's drug or alcohol use contributed to their impairment. Say, for example, in a motor vehicle collision where there are fatalities and somebody's driving behavior was affected by their use of drugs. So in those circumstances, we'll get information about the symptoms and signs somebody's maybe displaying as a result of their drug or alcohol use. We'll examine the drug content of a blood sample, see what the levels are, how heavily it's been metabolized, whether there are multiple drugs present. And based on those findings, we're then in a position to give an opinion about A, whether the person was impaired, and B, if the drugs or alcohol present or a combination of both contributed to their impairment. So an example of a case like that I was involved in recently involved a large number of fatalities that were caused by a commercial truck that failed to stop at a stoplight, went through the intersection, plowed through a group of motorcyclists, and resulted in the deaths of 5 people. The subsequent investigation suggested that the driver of the truck had been using methamphetamine. And so my role in that case as a forensic toxicologist was to interpret the findings from the laboratory in terms of how much drug was present, and then relate that to the effects that it would have had on his driving. So the toxicologist in a case like that is really there to educate the jury and the judge about the relationship between drug use and the kinds of effects it has that can impair a person's driving and result in the cause of a crash. I think the things that draw people to the forensic sciences in general as a profession is that you really feel that your education and training is really being put to some practical good. It's really doing something in support of society. It's making sure that people are appropriately sanctioned for if they commit a crime, that the state has the information necessary to convince a jury of the fact that the crime was committed and what the nature of the crime was. We do a lot of work during the investigation to ensure that people who might fall under suspicion, if they're not involved in the crime, can be exonerated or eliminated as suspects from the investigation. So applying science in a way that improves quality of life for people, that ensures that justice is appropriately applied, that's a very rewarding part of this field.
Someone might actually ask what odontology is, and it's a fancy word for dentistry. So a forensic odontologist is a dentist who assists law enforcement or the judicial process primarily in identifying people whose identity is unknown, such as a skull that might be found in the woods, or in the case of an accident or plane crash where you have a lot of people who can't be visually identified or identified by fingerprints. Because teeth are long-lasting and unique to every individual, we can sort those individuals out and relate the teeth that we have found to records of their teeth in life, primarily through x-rays. We solved a case recently in Louisiana where a teenager had been found in the center part of the state, abandoned dead in a barn, and there were no similar missing person reports for anywhere around that part of the state. And working with orthodontists and working with the police departments across the country and the FBI, we were able to identify that individual as a girl missing from Las Vegas, Nevada, and put her back to her family for burial, and also to help piece together what may have happened and how she ended up in Louisiana.
I'm a forensic toxicologist. I'm past president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and I'm also the president of the American Board of Forensic Toxicology. So forensic toxicology is the application of toxicology for the purpose of the law. Forensic toxicologists work in many different types of laboratories, such as testing for drugs in urine, or testing for drugs in blood from living persons, or testing for drugs and alcohol in decedents. We assist medical examiners in the death investigation process. In my position as toxicologist at the University of Florida, I work with both local and state law enforcement as well as state medical examiners in the investigation of traffic homicide cases for law enforcement, as well as decedents for the state medical examiners. The work that we do in the laboratory is very important. We assist the investigator, be it a law enforcement officer or a state medical examiner, to declare or certify the cause of an accident or the cause and manner of death. Because this is applicable to court and to litigation, either both in a criminal setting or a civil setting, the work that we do must be done with the utmost accuracy and reliability. The courts and the legal system depend on this work to be done accurately and properly. If we make a mistake, there could be a bad outcome. Someone could go to jail who should not go to jail, someone who's innocent. So the work that we do is very interesting. The work that I do tends to be somewhat high profile in nature because of my experience. I've worked cases such as the state of Florida versus Casey Anthony and U.S. versus Roger Clemens. In the Casey Anthony case, I was asked by the state to examine the remains of Kaylee for the presence of drugs and other chemicals in the remains that were found in the woods near the house of the Anthonys. In that case, we found nothing. That's what we expected. We really didn't expect to find anything, but if we had not done that work, had we not done it with the utmost care, then that would have become an issue in court. Regarding my work with the Roger Clemens case, as you know, Roger was charged with perjury. That is, when he testified in front of Congress, he stated under oath that he did not dope, did not use performance-enhancing drugs. So years later, his trainer gave some evidence to the investigators, and in the end, Mr. Clemens was charged with perjury. The government felt that he had lied when he testified in Congress. So my job in that case, working for Mr. Clemens, was to show that the evidence that was used by the government to prosecute Mr. Clemens for perjury was flawed. The evidence was not collected and maintained in the way that typical scientific evidence is. So it was my opinion in that case is that you could not rely on the scientific evidence in a criminal setting to charge someone for such a heinous crime as perjury. So in the end, to wrap up, the work that we do as forensic scientists, either toxicologist, criminalist, or pathologist, it has to be done with great skill, with great rigor, so the legal system can depend on it.